Dragons are a staple in the FromSoftware games. Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Elden Ring all have their take on this classic mythological being. And this is not to mention Sekiro, whose divine dragon cleaves closer to the Eastern depiction of these beings. Yet despite how much I love the spectacle of dragons like Fortisax and Placidusax, there is something about the Dark Souls dragons that has stayed with me, and I would go as far to say that these are my favourite presentation of dragons in any media. The dragons of Dark Souls aren't just massive beings of fearsome power, though they are that as well, but they are alien in concept, beings of mineral that existed beyond the bounds of life and death, and remain a mystery to both the audience and the denizens of the Dark Souls world. Ethereal and majestic, terrifying and inscrutable, the ancient dragons are all these things and more, and it's fair to say that the lore of Dark Souls would not be the same without them. So in this lore video we are going to do our best to unpack the nature of these mysterious beings and their legacy. We will be integrating the work of Lokey's Abyssal Archive, using his keen insights and translations to go a little further. I want to make it clear at the onset of this video that a lot of the work in this video leans heavily or draws from directly Lokey's book. I work with Lokey a lot and have his blessings to make this video. But that being said, it would mean the world to me if you would check out the Abyssal Archive link, Lokey's website, and his channel below. But before we get started guys, remember that if you like Souls lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. The ancient dragons are one of the pillars of the Age of Ancients, something we learn of in the very introductory cinematic of Dark Souls 1.
In the Age of Ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog. A land of grey crags, arched trees, and everlasting dragons.
So in this primordial era, we essentially have a grey world that is filled with rocks, trees, and these dragons. But these dragons, beings that we'd normally consider to be normal living beings, are not living at this stage because life does not yet exist. Life as a force and a concept did not enter the world of Dark Souls until fire brought disparity.
But then there was fire. And with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark.
And the fact that ancient dragons existed beyond such concept outside of them is reinforced by the path of the Dragon Covenant, who seek the power of those ancient dragons. The dragon headstone in Dark Souls 1 reads the following: "The Dragon Apostles seek ascendance of life itself, attainable by transformation into an ancient dragon. Dragon Apostles seek to escape the issues that come with being alive, i.e. death, and the curse of undeath, by becoming dragons, the ancient dragons, and escaping the cycle of life itself. In the grand scheme of things, life is only a recent phenomena, and dragons existed far beyond it." The fact that these ancient dragons was not affected by life is of course reinforced by the moniker everlasting. In context of what we have just discussed, everlasting means something with no beginning and no end, rather than immortal in the traditional sense. Indeed, this concept is reinforced by the description of the dragon scale from Dark Souls 1, which reads the following: "A dragon is inseparable from its scales, and the transcendent apostles, who seek the perpetuity of the ancient dragons, have crossed the very end of the earth to seek this invaluable treasure." Perpetuity, the perfect descriptor for beings that have no beginning and no end. Again, those of the path of the dragon seek to escape the cycle of life and death, to ascend beyond it, become these beings that have no beginning and no end, that just exist. However, while the dragons may exist in perpetuity, we do not. Time is always a factor, and that's where today's sponsor, Factor, comes in. Being mere humans subject to time constraints, Factor cuts out stressful meal planning and prepping, as meals are ready in minutes. No stress, no hassle, and no time. Factor makes it simple to keep a healthy diet. It's faster than fast food, helping you avoid the temptation of takeaways. If you are wanting to improve your diet but are overwhelmed as where to start, Factor is perfect for you, as it takes the guesswork out of eating well. Factor caters to any lifestyle needed, with keto, vegan, vegetarian and low-cal options. With over 27 meal options a week, there is plenty for everyone. And meal plans are completely flexible, ranging from 4 to 18 meals a week depending on your needs. Use my link or go to go.factor75.com and use code POGSMONOV50 for 50% off your first box. Click on the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video, and now back to the lore. They exist in this way because the ancient dragons are not living creatures of flesh and blood, but were more like living minerals, a concept explained by Miyazaki himself in the Design Works interview, where he said the following: "The ancient dragons of the Dark Souls world are a bit different from your conventional dragons. They are almost like the very minerals of the land, in that they are transcendental creatures that existed before life itself graced the world. However, their time has passed, and any remaining dragons are merely survivors. We will talk about these survivors in the next chapters, but for now let's stay focused on the Age of Ancients. The introductory cinematic tells us that the world was also surrounded by fog, and there does seem to be a relation between the ancient dragons and fog. And this is certainly something that can be often overlooked, but Lokey does a great job in Abyssal Archive in highlighting the importance of fog, and I quote Lokey now: "We are also told that this world was covered in fog, which seems to contradict the idea of mineral sameness. Weather phenomena often exist in a unique context in Dark Souls, and what we learn about the nature of fog in-game resolves this contradiction. The Ring of Fog clarifies that its power actually lessens one's presence, their sense of existence, thereby making detection more difficult. In short, fog embodies the power of non-existence, and manipulating it affects the state of physical being." I think Lokey is pretty much spot on here with his assessment of fog, in that it is a literal force of non-existence that filled the gap of nothingness in this primordial era. The effects of the fog ring show that this force can be used to blur reality, or to quote Lokey, "Fog erases the barriers of existence and everything it confines." This also lines up with later lore found in Dark Souls 2, with the iconic line uttered by the artificial ancient dragon, where he says, "The murk shifts and stirs, yet another stands before us. Then so be it, for the curse of life is the curse of want, and so you peer into the fog in hope of answers." While this might just be a turn of phrase to say look into the unknown, the item that we receive from the ancient dragon is called the Ashen Mist Heart. And my interpretation of this is that this is fog-based magic that allows us to peer back in time, that the power of fog allows us to break down causality and visit memories of the past. In short, the Age of Ancients was a primordial era of uniformity, grey, mineral, and barren of life, and the ancient dragons are not living creatures but living mineral, with no soul and no mortality, just as rock does not. As for how these beings are alive despite not being flesh and blood, well, this is the concept that is alien to us. They are just stone beings that live in a way that we cannot comprehend. And this is part of their mystery and allure. Just as there was uniformity in the world, there was uniformity among the dragons at this time. All of the later dragon kin, who are closer to traditional flesh and blood dragons, simply did not exist at this time. Yet of course this age of uniformity was coming to a close with the coming of the first flame. Fire changed the world. Gone was uniformity, as the world was now affected by opposing forces, life and death, and light and dark. The flame brought souls with it, and the souls were the base component for all of life. From here would come the giants, the gods, and the humans, and in time they would build their own societies before choosing to tear down the dragons. That is all well and good, but a point of the lore that I think many overlook is how the advent of fire affected the form of the previously non-living dragons. After all, we do have to question how these stone ancient dragons would eventually devolve into the likes of the drakes, In Abyssal Archive, Lokey discusses how the advent of fire and souls must have changed the dragons forever, and I quote him now. Yet the archdragons are only half living and didn't originally possess life. They simply existed as stone beings until, as Miyazaki explains it, they were attacked by the poison of life. With the advent of fire, there is no longer simple being, but a state of being alive or dead. And while these stone dragons can never be alive with bodies of stone, it is at this juncture that they gain souls to make them half-living. This is irrefutable. All life has a soul, and so dragons too must have had souls. It is an easy nuance to overlook that if the world became infected with life and death, then surely the dragons themselves would have been affected. Dragons had begun to be affected by life and soul, which is how this race would eventually give rise to the likes of Seath the Scaleless and Calamite, no longer sentient minerals of the Age of Ancients, but closer to traditional dragons. As these new dragons had souls, they too would be afflicted by concepts that only living things would understand: wants, needs, hunger, and other desires. Lokey suggests that this state of half-living is why the beings like the undead dragon exist in Dark Souls 1, and I quote Lokey now. The notion that the archdragons cannot die with as much finality as the other races finds further support in the undead dragons, more accurately dragon zombies. The undead curse is unique to humans, and popular culture traditionally imagines zombies as corpses revived by disease or necromancy. Add to that the dragon zombie's significant weakness to fire, and they have more in common with dead than undead enemies. There are no obvious signs of necromancy, however, so the archdragon's innate immortality is the most likely cause for their resurrection. The one encountered at the Valley of the Drakes was seemingly slain by a party of Astoran knights it killed in turn, losing its lower half to the ravine as the body rotted. However, its residual soul allowed the corpse to eventually revive as a quasi-dead being. What Lokey is essentially saying here is that the original form of the ancient dragons, the stone mineral, half-living beings, being affected by the disease of life, being granted a soul, would lead to some interesting situations, unique to being only half alive. The zombie dragons are pretty repellent beings, and really give off the impression of a great being that is suffering eternally, and is a great way of showing that these everlasting beings were never meant to exist in a world that had life and death. Now, the Gaping Dragon is a great example through which to examine how the ancient dragons were afflicted by life. The Gaping Dragon's lore in English makes it seem as though the ancient dragon is very disconnected from the archdragons, that it is a distant descendant, as the axe we get from his tail reads the following. This axe, one of the rare dragon weapons, is formed by the tail of the Gaping Dragon, a distant, deformed descendant of the everlasting dragons. From this description, one would be unlikely to class it as an ancient dragon. However, Lokey explains that via the translation, and from the words of Miyazaki himself, that this was not the intention of the Gaping Dragon, and in fact the Gaping Dragon was meant to be a much closer relation to the archdragons, and I quote Lokey now. The Gaping Dragon too is simply called a descendant, not a distant descendant, as the localization asserts. In fact, when discussing both of their designs, the director states that the Gaping Dragon and the Undead Dragon were created to reflect the notion that most archdragons are dead, and the few that survive are eaten away by madness. So in Lokey's translation, the word distant is completely removed, making its descriptor as closer to that of Calamite and the Ash Lake Dragon, who are both described merely as descendants in their weapons. The quote of Miyazaki that Lokey is referring to here is from the DesignWorks interview, in which he said the following. I particularly liked the Gaping Dragon. I was asked what's happening to the dragons now, and I explained that they have been eaten away by the toxins of life. By this I meant things like the emotions and acts that come with the lesser creatures, and then I mentioned the words insatiable greed. This quote makes it clear that while the gods were the ones to exterminate the dragons, it was the advent of fire that tarnished the purity of their everlasting form. With a soul comes the weakness of sentience and life, though Lokey believes it is also the source of one of the dragon's greatest modern advantages, their ability to breathe fire. Lokey is of course right. Fire did not exist in the Age of Ancients, it only came after the advent of fire. And fire is also the source of souls, and if dragons now have souls, then it makes sense that they are able to manifest flame from the soul within them that connects them to the flame. Lokey suggests that there was another consequence to dragons being granted a soul, that it would lead to them to traditionally reproduce, which in time would lead to the more flesh and blood variants. After all, this is now an age of disparity, and this applies to the dragons themselves. And over subsequent generations of breeding, they would eventually become more and more alive, resulting in the lesser drake species that we encounter today. Seath the Scaleless himself is a fascinating being, an albino who lacks the scales of his brethren, a fact that destroyed him, an identity crisis that would chase him for the rest of his life. Seath would chase the scales that he lacked forever, envying his brethren, feeling lesser, feeling like a freak among the ancient dragons. We can of course see that Seath was contemporary to the rest of the traditional ancient dragons, the archdragons with their scales of immortality. However, his unique form isn't really about him being abnormal amongst his kind. Rather, I've always believed it is just that he was the first to be born in the Age of Fire, and as such is affected by the powers of life and death, making him more of a being of flesh and blood than the rest of his everlasting kin who originated in the Age of Ancients. And he is the first of this sort of near descendant category of archdragons, those special dragons that we meet in Dark Souls that clearly aren't drakes and are closer to the ancient dragons, yet lack that traditional stony form. And to me, this particular breed or generation of dragons are those that were very close in generation to the original archdragons. And this is why they are quite often still referred to as ancient or archdragons despite lacking that original stone form. Because despite the fact Seath stands out from his stony kin, he is still referred to as an archdragon in the original Japanese. Lokey translates the Moonlight Greatsword in the following way: weapon born from the tail of the white dragon Seath, the scaleless archdragon who once betrayed his brethren. This is an important detail missed in the English translation, and Seath is not alone in being termed an archdragon, despite not sharing that classic archdragon design from the opening cinematics. Others that fall into this unique, abnormal class include Calamite, Midir, the Gaping Dragon, and the ancient dragon found in Ash Lake. I would also argue that Sin the Slumbering is likely falling into this same class of near descendant, whereas he is one of the earlier generations of archdragon descendants, hence why he retains the 4 legs rather than the 2 of lesser drakes. And yes, this is one of the keen observations made by Lokey in Abyssal Archives, that one of the main differences between the archdragons and the drakes in terms of physiology is the 4 legs that the ancient dragons have. The Hellkite and other drakes have only 2, but the ancient dragons always have 4. The Ash Lake Dragon, the Gaping Dragon, Calamite, and the fake ancient dragon of Dark Souls 2. Interestingly, this is also a design choice in Elden Ring, and it clearly seems to be something that FromSoftware use to denote different types of dragons. The ancient dragons of Fire Missoula with the 4 wings also have 4 legs. However, those beings termed as the modern dragons, such as Agil in Limgrave for example, again only have 2, marking them as lesser, more bestial descendants of the original ancient dragons. And the same is clearly the case in Dark Souls. And I think this 4-leg physiology marker is a good way of identifying those dragons which are close in generation to the archdragons. And so while yes, Sin might not be an archdragon or even that close a descendant, it is clear he is closer to them than the likes of the drakes. And the likes of Midir and Calamite are also clearly quite close descendants of the ancient archdragons because their forms cleave much closer to them. Indeed, we know that Calamite is still counted as an archdragon, thanks to the Obsidian Greatsword, the weapon claimed from his tail, which reads the following: This greatsword, one of the rare dragon weapons, is formed by the tail of the one-eyed black dragon Calamite, the last of the ancient dragons. The last of the ancient dragons, and this is clearly written from the perspective of someone who doesn't know of the Ash Lake ancient dragon, who is clearly a hidden being. Calamite is clearly very unique in his appearance, much like Seath, a sort of in-between of the ancient dragons and the lesser drakes. So in short, archdragons like Seath or Calamite were some of the first archdragons born as living creatures, or to be warped by the power of life. They are still close enough in relation that they are considered archdragons, but they are fundamentally different in their appearance, form, and temperament. And I think there's maybe been a lot of confusion in the past as to what is an archdragon and what isn't, and I just think there's a bit of nuance. It isn't as black and white as you maybe might think. Beings like Calamite and Medea, clearly not the original stone dragons, are close enough in relation to them, maybe one of the first or two generations after the advent of fire, that many still consider them to be an ancient or archdragon. There is another important species of dragon descendants that we need to acknowledge, the primordial serpents. We know from the description of the covetous serpent ring that serpents are imperfect dragons, and thus these primordial serpents are likely descendants of dragonkin, and their name, primordial, suggests that they are the first of all serpents, and are likely very old, one of the first races to arise out of dragonkind following the Age of Fire's onset. These are some of the most influential of the dragonkin, given their role in advising both gods and later men. Lokey aptly dissects their role in the New World Order, and I quote him now. The so-called primordial serpents are actually world serpents, hearkening to Jormungandr. Norse mythology dictates that this singular world serpent will herald Ragnarok by releasing its tail from its bite, tying back to Ouroboros as a symbol of nature's infinite cycle of creation, destruction, and rebirth. This fits well with Cath's declaration that a world serpent seeks the correct age for the universe. They act as wise men who attempt to lead the world along its natural path forward. Regardless, with that said, we now need to talk about the next important part of the dragon's timeline in the lore of Dark Souls, and that is of course their destruction. The progression of time is not something one thinks about when watching the epic opening cinematic to Dark Souls 1, as we are so swept up in the action and overarching narrative. However, there are some key details in the opening cinematic that do raise some questions about how much time has passed between the advent of the First Flame and the War of the Dragons. For example, when we see Gwyn, we see that he is crowned and an old man, surrounded by his knights. These knights clearly just didn't pop up as a result of Gwyn finding his Lord Soul. Instead, it speaks to the idea that the Lords found their souls a long time before they waged the war on the dragons, and in that time they developed their own complex societies. This is an idea presented by Lokey in Abyssal Archive, and I quote him now. The Medials were beasts when they found the Lord Souls, and the cinematic further implies that at least some lacked even a concept of clothing. They were a primitive people, yet Gwyn is an already aged man, with an army of fully armoured knights, capable of conjuring spears of lightning, like him, by the time they hunt the dragons. This requires time for the medial culture and technology to develop. Time to master language, writing, spellcrafting, weaving, dyeing, smelting, smithing, and the art of war. This gives us an interesting perspective on the closing days of the Age of Dragons, that the beings who found the souls of lords within the flame went off and established their own kingdoms and cultures, and as Lokey points out, they left the underground area where the dragons and archtrees can be found, and went to live in the above ground areas. Even areas like Tomb of the Giants or Izalith are still above the canopy of the archtrees which seem to lie near the centre of the earth. And as such, Lokey believes that in the time between the lords finding these souls within the flame and them attacking the archdragons, there was a good period of time where civilizations like Anor Londo and Izalith were established by these gods. Indeed, we know from Dark Souls 3 that society had advanced enough that humans partook in the War of the Dragons, as the dragon head shield wielded by the Ringed Knights reads the following. The Ringed Knights, by command of the gods, stood amongst the ranks of those who set out to slay the dragons, but their contributions were never lauded. This implies that the Ringed City was already built by the time of the War of the Dragons took place, meaning Gwyn had already made his pact with the Pygmy Lords, and human society had itself advanced a fair bit. This all speaks to a large passage of time from the discovery of fire to the gods finally taking on the dragons. Hundreds of years, if not millennia. But why? Why did the gods wait so long? And even then, if they had already established their own society on the surface, why did they even bother to take out the ancient dragons? Well, there are numerous reasons that we can speculate on. We do have to remember that the dragons had been the dominant life form since the beginning of time, and given what we see of the humanoids in the opening cinematic of Dark Souls in the early times, they were certainly in no position to take on the ancient dragons, and it makes sense that they would only be able to do so after establishing their own culture and ways of war. However, at some point in the development of their cultures, the leaders of these communities began to see themselves as gods, and they clearly turned their attention back down towards dragonkind, and among them they found a willing ally, Seath the Scaleless. The assumption in the community is that Seath's betrayal amounted to him telling Gwyn and the other gods about the source of a dragon's immortality, their scales, and this is why Gwyn specifically uses his bolts to peel apart their scales. However, what is more likely is that in general he was just a man on the inside, passing intelligence and leading his brethren into traps. Seath's motivations for doing so are patently clear. The shot of him standing atop a mound of his kin and crushing a stone scale is symbolic of Seath's envy and hatred of his stone kin. Perhaps he thought that he would be able to claim their scales for himself, or perhaps he just wanted to pillage the primordial crystal. Whatever the reason, it is clear from his frustrated cry in the cinematic that it did not give him much comfort. That being said, Seath did gain immensely from the betrayal. Firstly, he got his hands on the primordial crystal, an item that Big Hat Logan describes as pillaged from the ancient dragons. This primordial crystal grants Seath a fleeting immortality, though one that is tied to a rather fragile object, and we can still see Seath's desperation for his own scales, as he appears to have covered his own body in crystals. Secondly, he was of course awarded a prime position in the new pantheon, given the position of Duke and access to the royal archives, a place of knowledge where he would descend deeper into his obsession with immortality, crystals, and scales. Given the amount of corpses that Seath stands upon in the opening cinematic, and what we can see of the memory of this war in Dark Souls 2, it seems as though the gods were quite thorough in their extermination of the ancient dragons. And aside from the few archdragon descendants that survived, like Calamite or Midir and the Ash Lake Dragon, it's clear that the archdragons, the primordial force of this world, had been all but destroyed. And yet, despite their near extinction, it is clear that even in the current era of Dark Souls, an age of suffering and endless cycles, they still remain beings of great reverence and interest to the denizens of Dark Souls. So in this next chapter, we will look at their legacy after their extermination. In my opinion, probably the most interesting thing about the ancient dragons is their legacy in the world of Dark Souls, and the fascination that they inspire in the denizens of this world. I think one of the coolest remnants of their memory is Midir, the Dark Eater. As we discussed in an earlier chapter, the Ringed City was clearly established by the time of the Dragon Wars, their covenant with Gwyn established. Ultimately, the purpose of the Ringed City was to contain the Dark Soul, and to further that aim, Midir was employed. We learn of this via his soul, which reads the following. Midir, descendant of the Archdragons, was raised by the gods, and owing to his immortality, was given a duty to eternally battle the dark, a duty that he would never forget, even after the gods perished. So it's clear that Midir was taken as a young dragon from the remnants of the Archdragons at the end of the war, again reinforcing the fact that he must be close in relation to those Archdragons. We have also mentioned in part the dragon cult, but let's go a little bit further and contextualize it. It is clear that those who follow the path of the dragon aren't just after the considerable strength of the dragons, rather they are those who want to escape the cycle of life and death. This is the true allure of the ancient dragons, beings who once existed beyond life and death, and beyond the suffering that comes with being alive. I therefore find it interesting the way in which the dragon cult is depicted, especially in Dark Souls 3, where meditation seems to be an important part of dragon worship. Meditation is typically a practice in which one attempts to purge your mind of negativity, anxiety, and stress, and focus on the here and now. In the context of Dark Souls, perhaps the dragon cult sees it as a way of emulating the ancient dragons of old, beings who were once absent emotions and other curses of sentience, and thus by meditating it brings them closer to those pre-flame dragons. This is why a dragon cult exists in each of the Dark Souls games, because the suffering of humans and the undead curse is the common link between all three games. As long as the curse of the undead exists, there will be those who have a desire to escape this endless fate, and who will look back at the time of the dragons as something better. Time and time again, we see people becoming bitter or disillusioned with the endless cycle of suffering, and turning to the dragons as a means to escape this fate. Hawkwood, Aldea, and most prominently Gwyn's firstborn, the Nameless King, a grandee of the Pantheon, who is thrown in his lot with dragonkind and their worshippers. Dark Souls 2 in particular is the best in the series at focusing in on these concepts, both in terms of why one would be interested in the dragons, but it's also one of the most interesting explorations of the dragon's legacy in general. Aldea is one of the most central characters in this game, more so in the Scholar of the First Sin edition, and in many ways is one of the most fascinating characters in all of Dark Souls. Aldea was the brother to King Vendrick. In Dark Souls 2, the motivation of most characters is to find a way of breaking the curse of the undead. Vendrick's seeking of power is also an attempt to subvert the curse of the undead. As the King's Ring reads, "A powerful soul is like a curse, and Vendrick, King of Drangleic, used a powerful soul to keep the curse at bay. King Vendrick sought greater souls and made the giant's strength his own, but even still, the curse overcame him." Yet, a number of things ultimately threw Vendrick off. Firstly, Vendrick was unfortunate enough to have fallen under the sway of a dark being called Nashandra, one of the fragments of Manus. Nashandra was a being who coveted power, and when Vendrick realised this, he ultimately fled his kingdom, in an attempt to prevent Nashandra from getting what she wanted. However, under her influence, Drangleic did fall under the sway of the Dark, something that Chancellor Welliger tells us.
"The Queen brought peace to this land and to her king. A peace so deep, it was like the dark."
And ultimately Drangleic would fall to ruin because of Nashandra's influence. Not only would Vendrick flee, but Drangleic was really quite broken by the invasion of the giants, an event that was precipitated by Nashandra herself, who encouraged Vendrick to cross the seas and attack the giants in the first place. However, Vendrick didn't really want the flame to link it in the first place, for he and his brother realised that they were part of a cycle, the endless cycle of humanity, where one links the fire and life is allowed to blossom, for a time, and then the curse of the undead strikes and it all begins again. And so a new philosophy developed between the brothers, based on a deeper understanding of the nature of things. So Vendrick sought the flame in order to harness or stop the curse, and this is in line with your greater aim of coming to Drangleic in the first place. The undead come here because there is an understanding that great souls reside within the land of Drangleic, and with these great souls, you can stave off the undead curse. So Vendrick built up power, built a kingdom, thinking he could harness the power of flame to tame the curse. Both Vendrick and Aldea clearly resented being pawns of fate, that we are forced into this binary decision of linking the flame or letting it die. We are forced to do so because of the curse and the suffering it brings with it. While humanity may be a being of the dark and this is our natural form, it isn't a choice that we get to make ourselves. It is a state of being forced upon us, and whether it be our true form or not, it is still part of the apparatus that forces us down a set path. As humans, we are shackled by this fate. It is clear that Vendrick ruminated on these ideas, but ultimately failed, as despite his great power, he too fell to the undead curse. Yet Aldea clearly at some point realised that this wasn't the best path to take in order to get round the undead curse, something reinforced by the Aldea key, which reads the following. King Vendrick condemned his elder brother to the mansion. They both sought the truth, but through different means, and their fervour meant the eventual withering of their familial ties. Indeed, Aldea was looking for a solution to these problems as well, and it's clear that he did help found Drangleic, but in time he realised that becoming powerful and harnessing the flame wasn't enough. One need actually escape from the cycle altogether, rather than trying to control it. And this is something reinforced via the Aldea hammer, which reads the following. Hammer used by Aldean acolytes. Not used as a weapon, but as an instrument to dissect the bodies of the victims of their experimentation. They say that Lord Aldea was the king's elder brother and helped found Drangleic, but later he lost interest in the land's fortunes. Aldea lost interest in Drangleic and dedicated himself to experimentation. But what experimentation? Well, the truth becomes clear when we come to Aldea's manor, the House of Horrors. In these halls, it becomes clear that Aldea is the creator of the ogres that we have been fighting throughout the game and some other tortured beings. And curiously, there are piles of giant corpses lining the hallways, but we'll return to that. The fruit of Aldea's labour becomes apparent when we come to a massive cage at the back end of the manor. Dragons. Beyond this singular beast, we come to an area called the Dragon Eyrie, a perch for dragon kin, and at its centre is a temple dedicated to dragon worship, occupied by Dark Souls 2's dragon cult. Indeed, even the scientists present at Aldea Manor are referred to as dragon acolytes, and their gauntlets read, Several of the greatest minds converged in Aldea to weave strange new rituals, but rumours suggest that during the course of their work, their thoughts were not their own. And so Aldea called great minds to his side, and together they worshipped the dragon form, seeing them as the answer to breaking the cycle. The implication is of course that Aldea is the one that established the temple at the Dragon Eyrie, and the dragon cult itself, again seeking the dragon's ability to exist outside the cycle, and seeing such great value in these ancient beasts, it is no wonder that he established this temple in their honour. So while Vendrick thought he could harness the curse with power, Aldea thought the only answer was to remove yourself entirely from the cycle. The ogres and other cursed beings found at Aldea Manor are clearly failed attempts to recreate dragonkind. The dragons of Dragon Eyrie are not true dragonkind. Again, we see them following the physiology of drakes, lacking the forearms of true dragons. The guardian dragon soul, the soul of the red drake found in the cage, suggests that these drakes have fallen under the spell of Aldea, who clearly brought them here to roost at Dragon Eyrie. I speculate that this serves a dual purpose. Number 1, they serve as effective guard dogs, and number 2, they are good sources of research material into dragonkind. Indeed, this is why we find another type of dragonkin caged within the manor, the basilisks, so named after the mythological reptilian creature. Their potential relation to the dragons goes beyond their name, however, and is something Lokey ruminates on in Abyssal Archive, which I quote now. Even the basilisk, though never classified as a snake, is a lizard, with a peculiar power to convert biological matter to stone. We only encounter the beast in the sewers, or in the hollowed out arch trees in Ash Lake, so it is likely another distant relative of the archdragons, originating from the humid lower world. Yet something more interesting itself exists within the shrine, an ancient dragon, 4 arms and all. This dragon possesses the ability to see into the past, through the fog, a fact we covered earlier. Nashandra makes an interesting comment regarding this dragon after we have met it.
Brave undead, what did that dragon tell you? That thing is a prop. false deity. Don't be fooled, my undead.
If we kill this dragon, it drops a giant soul, and the truth is revealed. The giant corpses found in Aldea's manor were test subjects, and were the basis for this new artificial life form that now sits before us, no doubt combined with elements of the dragons found in the Dragon Eyrie. We are able to look back in time thanks to the power of this ancient dragon, and perhaps Aldea did the same, and this gave him better perspective on past events and how long this cycle has really lasted.
Once the Lord of Light banished dark and all that stemmed from humanity, and then assumed a fleeting form.
So how is this being created from a giant specifically, and not a human instead? Well, I think a widely accepted idea in the community is that giants must be close in terms of physiology and relation to the dragons, allowing Aldea and his researchers to reverse engineer one. And this is not a difficult idea to swallow given the appearance of the giants appears to be sort of tree-like, making us think of the arch trees that existed in the Age of Ancients. The fact they are tree-like is reinforced by the idea that they literally turn into trees, as we see dotted around Drang Lake, and this seems to be the form they take after some period of time or after they have been killed. And the seed of a tree of giants, a seed dropped from one of these trees, reads the following. When the giants fell, they grew into great trees. Death is not the end, for anything that has ever once lived remains a part of a great cycle of regeneration. But what of those outside the cycle? This last question in particular is very interesting. Is it indeed implying that the giants somehow exist outside the cycle like the archdragons did, thereby reinforcing the idea that they are related to the ancient dragons? Remember in the earliest chapter we discussed the fact that because the dragons were quasi-living, they didn't really die truly, they just kind of rotted away like the dragon zombies. Is this a similar effect in regards to the giants, that because they are not fully living, when they die they just become something else, something degraded? I do wonder if this had anything to do with Aldea's final form. Aldea seems twisted and wood-like as well, and it is possible that in trying to apply some of these sciences to himself, he became what he is now, a tree-like being that is very reminiscent of a fallen giant. And perhaps in that way he did achieve his goal, because while he hasn't been able to break the cycle entirely, he is now something completely different. No longer bound by space or time or life, he exists within the flame itself, able to manifest himself at will at any space he so chooses. But Lokey goes further in trying to discuss the relevance of the giants being tied to the dragons. If the giants themselves are related to the dragons, are humans also distant kin to the dragons? Did all life in fact come from these primordial beings? After all, where did the humanoids from the introductory cinematic of Dark Souls 1 come from? In the Tomb of the Giants, Lokey highlights the fact that there are two variants of giant skeletons, the upright ones and the quadrupedal ones, seeing this as an evolutionary trend, that giants evolved from a more bestial state to the upright bipedal race as they are today. However, Lokey also highlights a third, more serpentine skeleton found within the Tomb of Giants, and I quote Lokey now, "Littered across the tomb is a third type of skeleton unlike the other two. While still retaining a humanoid element, the skull's pronounced jaw has become a snout, the teeth have become a set of sharp fangs, and the cranial area has become slightly elongated. The body has 4 limbs, ending in claws instead of fingers and toes. The beast skeleton is the ancestral link between the modern giants and these serpentine humanoids, which seem to have gone extinct as the giant lineage evolved into its present bipedal form. The giants as we know them seem to have evolved from a serpentine ancestor, likely tracing their lineage to actual serpents, and thereby dragons. There were no other living creatures in the world of the Age of Ancients. So where else did life come from? Does it not make sense that as the dragons were afflicted by life, and as they evolved and mated over generations, that in time, giants, humans, and the gods could have eventually come to be? An extreme, distant relation to the original form of all life, the archdragons. It's really something to think about, and it really hammers home the importance of these majestic beings. So thanks guys, that is my video on the ancient dragons of Dark Souls, fascinating beings of minerals who existed beyond the systems of life itself. If you liked this video, please give me a like and leave your thoughts down below on anything you think I missed or anywhere you disagree. Again, I'd like to give a shout out to Lokey, whose work was definitely the inspiration and jumping off point for my own discussion on this subject. But until next time guys, let me know your thoughts below and what you'd like me to cover next. And I will see you in the foggy Age of Ancients. Take care and have a wonderful day.